So I'll start my project in Eclipse. And because I have installed from this marketplace the Spring Boot starter, I could visit Spring Boot Initializer and download the package, but actually this is better because it's embedded into Eclipse. You don't have to import it. It's where you expect the folder to be without any folderol. I'm going to call this RESTful Uno game version 2. I already have version 1. Review my group ID. That's good. It's pretty much what you used this wizard for the last time. That's another nice thing about using it. It remembers your last settings, so your group IDs will be there for you. Artifact ID, I'm happy with that. And basic package is good, I think. And the jar, all that stuff, test all that. And all we need this time, so I've these checkboxes at the top, and again, this is an advantage of using this plugin into Eclipse, is that recently used dependencies become checkboxes at the top. We're going to use Spring Web, but I'll pretend like that's not up there as a checkbox, and I will look for it. Spring. Let's put in Web. There we go. Check that one off. And we started a project where you can develop REST API. No database configuration. We're not going to use database yet. So just the REST API part, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. So I've put my design requirements here up on the left, and we'll first look at Post. So that's going to support the URI called games, and it will create a game if one does not exist. The request body will contain the game ID. That is a request body coming from the client, and we'll show you client configuration as well. And then it returns the game ID. It echoes it back, and we'll take a look at that implementation in one moment. So in my Java folder, I have this. So this is, remember, where main will be, and pretty much by itself. In controllers is where I'll have, this is where the REST controller is. This is essentially, you can think of it as the front end facing. It's not directly because it's embedded in a web server, but it's essentially the front facing method where your application is entered into and requests are made. Then I have models with a game, and we'll look at that. And then in services, I've copied over the game code, pretty much directly from the old console app. I directly copied it into the services packages, but the only modification is I put services at the top, and here I have both the game API and the turn it returned, untouched from the console application, other than the package name. And over here in the models package, I have my game class, and this will be the client server game, and it has one attribute, the game ID. So it's within the class, and that'll make it convenient for transferring client server information. We'll see that later. There's typically more information in here than just one property, but this is structured properly. So this is the way you should do it in a model, and then we'll take a look at how that model is used. In the game controller, we're going to find our post method. So the attribute post mapping, there's others you'll encounter in tutorials. This is the simplest way to do it. Post mapping, games. So this is the URI we talked about in the design portion of the REST API, games. That matches this design requirement here. So it doesn't matter what we call the method. We've mapped it to games, and that's how it's going to look like from the URL perspective. All right, then we all have this second annotation here. So post mapping, and this is where post has the at request body. So the request, as we are going to see, is composed of in its body of a JSON object, JavaScript object notation, and that will contain the game information, which, as we saw, is simply the game ID. So that'll be constructed for us. We call getGame, that's our factory method. And we're not interested in return value because we're not returning the game API back to our client. All we need to return back to it is essentially we're echoing back the original game ID back to the client. That'll show the client that the server has done everything appropriate. Otherwise, the client will get an error. Okay, we'll test this in a bit. So I'm going to use a client testing software harness called Postman. So I'll assume that you can install this and get this configured. I think you have to log into it because it remembers on the internet your configurations and the tests that you've run. Now notice there's a lot of tabs up here at the top that may be confusing to us. I'm going to go ahead and close all the tabs. These are all the tests that I've done recently. I guess I'll save changes. All right. Don't save. All right. Clean set of wheels. I'm going to create a post method here. Now, why am I doing this? So in a browser, you can use get, like the URL in a browser. That's a get method, a read method. You get a web page. If you remember when we were running our test server to running HTML and CSS and some JavaScript, we see in our development environment where Light Server is showing the GET requests. That's what's happening. It's a GET request. So now we're going to do a POST request, which we can't do directly in a browser. That's why we're using Postman. Now you can just create a new request here, but I always like to put my requests in collections. So I'm going to perhaps a little bit verbose. So I always like to have collections to organize my things, and you can blow away the collections as a group when you're done with them. So within this collection, I'll do a new request. So I'm going to call this post. New game. Okay. Now, notice, by the way, I called it post new game, but the HTTP verb, which is here, okay, we discussed HTTP verbs in the REST API theoretical discussion, and here you see them. So a handful are used in REST, and one of them is get, which this wakes up as, but we're going to make this a post. And then we'll enter in our URI. Actually, we need more than that. And this is one. All right, localhost 8088. So remember our other port name when we were testing Light Server. When we run our Spring Boot and we have a Spring Web included in it, it'll create a web server for us listening at the port 8088. That's why localhost this machine 8088. Change this URI. It would work over the internet. So first to test our server, and actually let's just send it because we're not running our server, so it'll take a long time to time out and say error connected. So need to run our server. And this is a choice I think you only get when you use that internal tool, run as a Spring Boot app. I think, I'm not sure. So it's running. Now we'll send our request again. And I actually put a couple of bugs in our code. So this request is not going to work. Okay. And we have bad request. Okay. Client doesn't know much. So you need to look over and notice that Spring itself scrolled. I'm going to make this full screen for the moment. Spring itself scrolled over here. And this is essentially the server log. It's also in a file. You need to look at the server log to really find out more information was required. Request body is missing. And really it's talking about game, right? Request body is missing for this. So what's happening? Let's analyze that. So request body, that sounds a lot like this. So what's happening is that this is a Spring Bean because Spring is taking the request body. Remember in Postman, actually, I didn't. We need to do this in Postman. I'll create a request body that contains the JSON for this game. That request body is taken from the JSON and converted into a Java object. And in order to do that, it needs to be a Spring Bean because Spring won't know about it otherwise. It won't look at it. It's just a normal. You can mix in Java classes. Our basic service is going to be mostly maintained just as a normal Java class. It's perfectly fine. But game has to be a Spring Bean. And it could be many things. The most basic, in a lot of these annotations, they really are the same thing. underneath. They just, if you just want to say it generically, at component, it will import this. Oh wait, hold on. I had to pause to correct my spelling, at component, and we can see the import from the Spring stereotype of a component class. The other thing that we're going to find we need to do, and we'll have a bug in, is that this needs, I'll just take this, I have this constructor for my purposes, but because I created a constructor, the default constructor, remember, goes away. Spring Boot needs the default constructor. Why? It's going to be used for dependency injection here. It has to be created. Well, non-default constructors require business logic. Like I see it can, via reflection, it can tell this constructor needs a parameter of a string type, but it has no knowledge about what the business rules are about how that string is to be set. So it won't do that. It needs a default constructor, the no parameter constructor, or it won't construct a Spring Bean. So Spring Beans require default constructors. If you don't write a constructor, you don't worry about it because the compiler will provide it. Now remember to stop the server before you run again, otherwise your port will collide with it. You're going to collide with the port, and it's a pain. And then we'll test this again in Postman. Let's do our send request again, and we hope it works this time. Still a bad request. Let's find out what happened. So our exception says required request body is missing, and that, in other words, I haven't created the request body yet in Postman. So the error here is on the client and not on the server. Let's create the required request body here. So I'll go to body, raw, and if this says text, change this to JSON. And remember when we were creating objects in JavaScript, just by typing them in curly braces? That's what JSON is, and that's why JSON is becoming popular. It's natural. It's a natural with JavaScript. It's the way JavaScript writes its objects, and this is what we're using here. So what we need is something that will map to game ID, called exactly that, game ID, and the key has to be in quotes. That's a requirement. If the value is not a string, it's not in quotes, but in this case it is. So we're going to call this test game. You can always put a comma here. That will cause an error in MySQL, but since this is a list, you can put a comment there if you want to. And we'll send this request, and we still get that error. One moment. So now my JSON's bad. What is wrong with it? Hold on a moment. I don't think it liked the comment at the end of that, which is valid in JavaScript. So I kind of disagree with that, and it works. So the server responds. Let's take a look at our server code again, our controller, the post controller. Notice getGame uses the factory method. No throws that would have been reported. The game then is reported back from getGame got getGame ID, and it reports that back to the server that echoes it back. So it looks like our post request is working. We'll work on the GET request next.